Hey everyone, and welcome to Font of Inspiration. Today we'll be talking about writing NPCs. In my opinion, NPCs can really make or break a scenario, or adventure, whatever you want to call them. And that's why I place quite a bit of emphasis on them. I tend to go for the places and faces kind of adventure writing style, where I focus on the setting and the characters in it. And this is the first in a series of videos where I discuss how I write scenarios, including things such as how I write NPCs, places, encounters, how I structure scenarios, and how I go for a specific tone, which is especially important if you're writing with a specific established setting or IP in mind. So, let's jump right into how I write NPCs. Now, bear in mind that I write NPCs differently based on the type of game I'm running or the game I'm writing for. But here are what I think are some of the core features when it comes to making NPCs. Let's start with personality. Now, what I do when I'm trying to gauge the sort of general personality of an NPC is I take a fictional character. I don't start with a real-world reference. I start with a fictional character, and then I layer or sprinkle elements of maybe people I know in real life on top. Now, there's a reason for this. The people you know in real life, they're very complex, they're multi-layered, they're not really easy to distill, at least a lot of the time, they're not easy to distill into a few character traits. Whereas fictional characters are sort of distilled versions of people that have very prominent or obvious character traits. So that's why I take a fictional character first, because it's probably going to be easier for the players to get a sense of what this character is like. And then, just to make it a little more idiosyncratic, to make it a little more customized or unique, you can take elements from people you know in real life and then sprinkle them on top. I tend to go for the Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones type of naming, where if the names are fictional, that they don't have a real counterpart in our real world, I still try to make them sound like real names, like Eddard, Edward, Joffrey, Jeffrey, and so on. But I think the most important thing about a name is that it's easy to pronounce. So don't go with those very complex and long names with 1,000 consonants in them that are absolutely impossible to pronounce, but rather make it easier for your players. I'm not saying that you should use Bob the Wizard or something like that, but let's say it's Broderick the Wizard. That's pretty easy to remember. Well, it's based on a real name. Let's say Matthew Broderick. Take his surname, use it as a first name, boom, you've got a name for a wizard. And you can use other techniques as well. For example, alliteration, very common in Marvel heroes. Peter Parker, J. Jonah Jameson, and so on. Now that we've gotten the very basic stuff out of the way, personality type, name, we can start getting into the slightly more nuanced stuff. And I suggest that you flesh out your NPCs based on their prominence in the scenario. And what I mean by that is that how often are the player characters going to meet this NPC? What is their role? How big is their role in the scenario? If the PCs are going to be running into this character constantly, for instance, if it's a shopkeeper they return to again and again to buy equipment from, then it's probably a good idea to give them some kind of unique personality, a bit of depth, maybe some connections to other characters, and so on. One thing I usually try to give most, even non-prominent NPCs, is some kind of visual feature of interest. So something about how they look, or how they carry themselves, or how they act that stands out from other NPCs. The most basic example would be a character having a scar across their face, or maybe having a limp, or something like that. But you can go a step further with the nuance in terms of visual features. And it doesn't have to be anything that cliche. You can use some of those cliches and maybe add a twist to them, make them your own and give them something new. But they're cliches for a reason, in that they're easy to remember, they're well known, they're tropes, they are established ways of making characters memorable. Now, what about those more prominent characters? What do you do with their personalities? Do you keep them two-dimensional, or do you flesh them out a little bit more? I wouldn't go overboard with fleshing them out, but I would give them something more interesting than perhaps the quote-unquote extras in your adventure. One way of doing this is by giving them two different levels of personality. You could have their outward personality, so how they present themselves to others, how they wish to be seen by others, and then their inward personality. So that would be things like their hopes, dreams, fears, prejudices, biases, and so on. Another common feature of NPCs that a lot of people making NPCs focus on is the way they talk, specifically accents, but I would like to broaden this to just generally the way they communicate and how they use body language. So let's start with, what do they sound like when they talk, if they use speech as their primary mode of communication? Do they have an accent? Do they speak very quickly? Or do they take their time and speak slowly? And what does that communicate about this character? Now, obviously, speech isn't the only way of communicating, and let's say that this character uses sign language. What nuances are present in the way they sign? And remember to keep things respectful. If, for instance, a character has dysphemia, which is stuttering, or speech sound disorders, especially if a person in your group has a speech disorder. So the way a character communicates and how they carry themselves, how they move, that's just as important, if not more so, than a visual feature like interesting color hair or a scar on their face, or perhaps a certain set of clothing that's very ostentatious. And one really good way to make NPCs memorable that relates to how they communicate is to make their way of speaking or communicating in other ways really distinct from other PCs. Now you could think of, for instance, Pumat Sol from Critical Role as an example of a really distinct and memorable NPC, specifically because they speak in a way that's very different from any other character in the whole campaign. And most likely the reason why Matthew Mercer made this character the way he is and made him speak the way he does is because he knew that the player characters and the players are going to meet this character again and again, so why not make him very distinct? And that might create a situation where every time players return to that specific NPC, they might at first think, oh yeah, that was that funny NPC that talked in a certain way, and then as time goes on, they'll start anticipating meeting that NPC again, and they'll start to wait for it. Oh yeah, when are we going back to Pumat Sol? And just as a quick disclaimer, remember that tabletop RPGs do not require acting, so all of this can be done through description as well. You can describe how an NPC talks, you can describe how they move. I cannot emphasize this enough, you do not have to get into character in order to portray NPCs effectively. You can, but it's not required. Next, I usually try to give my NPCs, especially the more prominent ones, some basic relationships with other NPCs. Now, because GMs have to manage several NPCs at a time, I usually try to keep relationships between NPCs as simple as possible. And for this, I distill their relationships down to a system called buddies and rivals. I first encountered buddies and rivals from the Alien tabletop RPG by Free League, and it means that each NPC, and in that game also PC, has one buddy and one rival. So the buddy is their good friend that they would defend, possibly with their life, and the rival is someone who they really don't like that much, or maybe even actively hate, and perhaps would throw under the bus if the appropriate situation presented itself. This method is relatively quick and clean, and it gives a good idea of which NPCs like or dislike each other. You should also consider how your NPCs react to PCs. Are they initially friendly, indifferent, or maybe even hostile? Is this reaction based on their personality, perhaps their biases or their prejudices? Or is it based on something concrete that they have experienced? For instance, perhaps the PCs wronged them in some way in the past. One of the best things I ever realized about making NPCs, and this is thanks to Sly Flourish's Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, is that secrets and clues, meaning those breadcrumbs of information that lead PCs onwards in the adventure, don't have to be, and actually shouldn't be, tied to specific NPCs. Because if you have information that's tied to a specific NPC, that NPC might get killed off, or perhaps the PCs never even meet them, and then that information is lost and that plot thread goes nowhere. And this is why my suggestion is to have a separate list of secrets and clues that you can assign to any NPC, within reason of course. and I highly suggest that you use common sense here. The 5-year-old kid would probably not know about the ancient curse related to the old gods, or maybe they would. That would actually probably be pretty interesting, but you get the idea. I do break this guideline myself sometimes, but that's only if I have a secret or clue that's very specific to a certain character. I usually try to keep my secrets and clues separate. And even in these cases, I'll still be ready to give that secret or clue to another NPC if something happens to the original NPC. And of course, this is only if you think that the secret or clue is important enough to still keep in the game. Remember that it's perfectly fine to let certain plot threads or certain adventure hooks just fizzle out and be forgotten. The players will never know the difference. My final tip is, and this isn't really to do with creating NPCs, but it's more about managing NPCs while you play, is to roll with the punches. Remember to keep NPCs fairly flexible and malleable when you bring them into play. If the PCs come up with something cool related to that NPC, go ahead and allow them to create that new aspect or that new feature of the NPC. That way your players will have a sense of agency and involvement in the story being created, and they will be able to see their personal touch in the characters that you populate your setting with. Okay, those were just a few tips on how to create memorable NPCs. Now, if you would like to see some of my NPCs in action, you can find 2 free scenarios on my Patreon page. One of them is a 5th edition horror adventure set in a small, creepy village, while the other is a post-apocalyptic Mad Max-style scenario using the Savage Worlds Adventure Edition system. Go ahead and grab those for free, and if you like my work, please consider becoming one of my patrons. It really helps me write these adventures in the future, and it also helps this channel grow. Patrons get access to everything on my page. That includes the newest adventures and the previous ones as well, and at the moment there are 2 tiers you can choose from. The standard Inspired tier, that's for €5 a month plus VAT, and then there's the Early Bird tier, which is only €2 plus VAT a month. There are a limited number of Early Bird subscriptions available, so if you want everything at 60% less, now's your chance. In addition to the scenarios I write, you can find maps, roll tables, and all kinds of other goodies. And you will also see more collaborations with other people in the field. For example, this month's post is a full-length cinematic-style sci-fi horror scenario written by myself, featuring cartography from Miscast Maps, and also featuring audio from Michael Gelfi and art from Hans Zenuga. Thanks for watching, and stay inspired.